Today, I'm going to teach you a technique I absolutely love to use in cosplay. It results in a super fancy looking garment, but it's extremely simple to execute. It's basically just a combination of dip dyeing and lace overlay. I used this technique to create my skirt for my Hannah Alexander design Art Nouveau Snow White cosplay, and also to create the blouse and skirt panels for my Jester cosplay. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you the white to pink gradient that I used on my Jester costume. Here's what you'll need for this technique. Your garment material. This should be a natural fiber fabric to ensure that it will take the dye. I used linen for Jester and silk chiffon for Snow White. You can do this with synthetics, but you'll have to have a dye that is specifically designed for synthetics. And in my experience, it's harder to use those dyes evenly. Dye. RIT is a great dye to use for natural fibers, and it comes in a ton of colors. You can use the liquid or the powder type dyes, it's the same. And if your gradient is really extreme, you might need a few colors. For Jester, I just used petal pink, but for Snow White, I used lemon yellow and tangerine. Salt or vinegar, depending on your fabric. This helps the dye attach itself to the fabric fibers. Your RIT dye package will tell you which to use depending on which specific fabric you're using. A large pot or container. A large pot is the best solution because then you can keep it hot on the stove while you dye. But if you're dyeing too much fabric to evenly fit into a pot at once, you might need to boil your water and then pour it into a larger container like a storage bin or a clean trash can. And finally, lace and matching thread. There are a bunch of different types of lace, and I'm not going to pretend that I know enough about all of the different kinds to name them or explain them, but for this project you need a specific kind of lace. This kind of lace is not what we want. You can see that it behaves like a fabric. It's very uniform. Instead, we want this kind of lace, which is basically lace shapes that have been built on top of a fine mesh. I usually get this kind of lace from fabric.com, although the Casa collection at Joann Fabrics just got a few laces like this in recently. You'll have the easiest time if you find a fabric that has a finished edge like this. Make sure that the yardage you buy has enough of this finished edge to match the finished edge of your project. So if you're making a skirt with 2 yards of hem, you need at least 1 yard of a lace that has both edges finished like this. You'll also need your basic sewing supplies, an iron, a sewing machine or a hand needle, scissors, and straight pins. We'll start with the fabric dye. You'll need to decide based on your specific project whether you want to dye your entire yardage first or if you want to cut out your pattern pieces and then dye those. Some of that will depend on what kind of garment you're making. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to dye this little rectangle just to show you the technique rather than make a whole garment. You should also have a few test swatches so you can make sure that your dye comes out the way you want before you sacrifice your final fabric. First, fill up the pot with water and add the salt or vinegar that the package calls for. I'm going to demonstrate this here at the table because my stove is in a weird, small, dark corner of my kitchen that's bad for filming, but you should be doing this at the stove. Add your dye, but be conservative with it. It's very easy to add more dye if the color is too light, but much harder to dilute it if you make the color too dark. In order to get a smooth gradient, you want to wet your fabric first. Make sure your fabric is thoroughly and evenly wetted, otherwise you'll get patchy dye. You also want to wet your swatches for consistency. Once your water is boiling, dip in one of your swatches and just kind of swoosh it around a little. Take it out often to check the color, but remember that it will end up much darker when wet than it will look when dry. If you've had your fabric in for a minute or more and it's still not getting the color that you want, then you might want to add more dye. When you think it looks right, take it out and rinse it in cold water. Then run your iron over it to dry it quickly so you can check the color. You may want to do this on a towel unless you want to stain your ironing board cover. If that looks right, great. It's time to move on to your real fabric. If you're not happy, now is the time to adjust your dye bath as necessary and try another swatch until you're happy. To achieve a gradient dye, you just want to keep your fabric moving. If you leave your fabric in one spot for too long, then the dye will be more likely to leave a noticeable line across your fabric. The parts of the fabric that you want the darkest should be in the dye the most, and the parts that you want the lightest should be in the dye the least. If you're using more than one color of dye, I would start with the lightest and then add the darker dye once you're happy with the lighter color. You can also just add more of your single dye color towards the end to ensure that the very bottom of your fabric is the most vibrant. Once you think your you're happy with your dye job, rinse the fabric in cold water until it runs clear, and then iron or otherwise dry your fabric before you get rid of your dye bath, just in case you decide it needs another dunking. Once your dye job is finished, it's time to overlay the lace. Measure the length of the hem that you need to cover, and then cut that length of lace. Then decide how much of the garment you want to be covered by the lace vertically. Remember, you want the lace to enhance the gradient, not conceal it. Then start cutting out the lace. You can decide how precise you want to get with this. The more precisely you cut, the more precisely you'll have to sew, but the neater it will look up close. Once your lace is cut out, lay it onto your fabric and pin it. Make sure you're happy with how it looks. You may decide that you want to cut it down further or even add some more bits of lace to ease the transition. Then when you're happy, it's time to sew. There are 2 ways to do this. If you want to be super fancy about it, you can hand stitch the whole thing down. It would have been doable to hand stitch the lace on my Jester costume because these are small segments. But for Snow White, this is 5 yards of hem. That would have taken forever. So instead, I just sewed it on my machine. You don't need to go along every edge with your sewing machine. As long as you choose a thread that matches well, you can basically just stitch down the middle of each shape. You can see from the inside of my Snow White skirt that the stitching is very vague, but from the outside, it still looks nice. And that's it. You have created something that looks super intricate, but actually only requires 2 steps. When people see my Snow White cosplay, they freak out about the skirt, even though the bodice took 10 times as long to make. Let me know if you have any questions, and I would love to see what you create with this technique. Make sure to subscribe for more cosplay and crafting tutorials.